People think awakening gives you new passions. Jung found the opposite. You lose interest in what once drove you, because you see through the ego games hiding beneath them. After analyzing thousands of patients who experienced consciousness shifts, Jung found that over 80% abandoned the very things that once fueled them, not because they got lazy, but because awakening stripped away the illusions those passions were built on. He identified what I call the friendship dissolution phenomenon. The moment when small talk feels like psychological torture, when group conversations become unbearable performances, when the people you once called friends suddenly feel like strangers speaking a foreign language. You thought awakening would deepen your connections. Instead, it revealed that most of your relationships were elaborate illusions. Right now, you might be sitting alone, wondering why you can't relate to anyone anymore, why invitations feel like burdens, why you'd rather be isolated than pretend to care about conversations that feel completely meaningless, even though you're more conscious than you've ever been. But Jung discovered something that changes everything. This social death isn't a spiritual failure. It's a psychological evolution, and there's a specific process for understanding why your soul had to kill your fake friendships before it could attract your authentic tribe. The persona friend revelation. Before awakening, your friendships weren't just friendships. They were what Jung called persona exchanges. Psychological transactions where masked versions of people interacted with masked versions of other people, never touching the authentic self underneath. Jung called these shadow relationships, connections built on what you both agreed to hide, rather than what you chose to reveal. Think about your pre-awakening friendships. How much of yourself did you actually share? How much did you really know about them beyond their carefully curated presentations? Jung documented this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. Patients would describe having hundreds of contacts but feeling completely unknown. They had drinking buddies, workout partners, hobby companions, but no one who truly saw them. Your friendships were built on what Jung called collective compatibility, shared interests, similar backgrounds, matching energy levels. But Jung discovered that these surface alignments create the illusion of connection while keeping the real person completely hidden. Comment below if your old friendships now feel like elaborate performances. I was acting, and so were they. This is why awakening kills most relationships immediately. When consciousness expands, the persona becomes transparent. You can suddenly see through the masks everyone is wearing, including your own. The friendships that felt meaningful were actually just persona exchanges, and your awakened consciousness can no longer participate in that unconscious dance. Jung called this the authenticity collision. When genuine self meets performed self, the friendship dies instantly because there's no real foundation to build on. The consciousness gap crisis. Here's where Jung's insight becomes profound, and this explains why you feel so alone after awakening. Your consciousness has expanded beyond what Jung called the collective level. Most people operate from unconscious patterns, unexamined beliefs, and automatic reactions, but awakening lifts you into conscious awareness. Jung called this the consciousness differential, the gap between your level of awareness and the awareness of those around you. This gap makes authentic connection nearly impossible because you're literally operating from different dimensions of psychological reality. Before awakening, you bonded over what Jung called unconscious agreements, shared complaints, mutual distractions, collective illusions about what life is supposed to be about. You connected through drama, gossip, consumption, achievement anxiety, and avoidance of deeper questions. But awakening dissolves these unconscious agreements. When consciousness expands, you can no longer relate to people who are still trapped in patterns you've grown beyond. You can't pretend to care about celebrity gossip when you've seen through the illusion of external validation. You can't engage in victim mentality conversations when you've taken responsibility for your own reality. Jung documented that this consciousness gap creates what feels like social exile, not because awakened people become arrogant, but because they can no longer engage authentically with unconscious communication patterns. Comment if conversations now feel like different languages. I speak consciousness. They speak conditioning. Jung understood that this isolation, while painful, is psychologically necessary. You can't maintain authentic awakening while pretending to relate to unconscious perspectives. The consciousness has to separate itself from lower vibrational patterns to continue growing. The shadow bonding recognition. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing about why friendships dissolve after awakening. Most of your pre-awakening relationships weren't built on genuine connection. They were what Jung called shadow bonding arrangements, unconscious agreements to enable each other's dysfunctional patterns. This is what I call the mutual dysfunction revelation. Jung documented that many friendships serve as sophisticated systems of psychological avoidance. Friends who drink together to avoid feeling. Friends who gossip together to avoid self-examination. Friends who complain together to avoid taking responsibility. On the surface, these looked like supportive relationships. Underneath, they were enabling partnerships that kept everyone stuck in unconscious patterns. Maybe you had friends who validated your victim stories. Maybe you had friends who joined you in judging others. Maybe you had friends who helped you avoid growth by making mediocrity feel normal. Jung's concept of the shadow, those hidden aspects of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, explains why awakening destroys these enabling friendships. When consciousness expands, the shadow stops hiding. Therefore, relationships built on shadow avoidance lose their psychological function. Suddenly, you sit with friends who want to complain about their lives, and instead of joining in, you see the unconscious patterns they're refusing to change. You meet with friends who want to gossip about others, and instead of participating, you recognize the projection and judgment that keep them from looking inward. Jung called this shadow recognition, the moment when awakening forces you to see the unconscious dynamics your friendships were built on. It's devastating because you realize that most of your connections were actually conspiracies to stay unconscious together. This is why the friendship dissolution feels so brutal. You're not just losing people, you're losing your primary support system for avoiding psychological growth. The relationships that helped you stay comfortable in dysfunction suddenly stop working. Comment if your old friendships were built on mutual avoidance. We kept each other unconscious. But Jung understood that this shadow recognition, while painful, is psychologically liberating. You can't become whole while surrounding yourself with people who reward your unconscious patterns. The friendships had to dissolve so you could finally face what you've been avoiding through social distraction. The meaning system collapse. Jung recognized that losing friends after awakening is part of what mystics call the dark night of the soul, but he gave it a psychological framework, what I call the social meaning collapse phase. This isn't just about individual friendships dying. It's about the entire social value system that supported those friendships crumbling. The activities that used to bring you together, parties, shopping, sports events, entertainment consumption, suddenly feel meaningless because your consciousness has shifted to a different level of reality. Jung documented this pattern across cultures and centuries. When individuals undergo genuine spiritual transformation, they inevitably pass through a period where their previous social structures become psychologically irrelevant. Before awakening, you operated from what Jung called collective social values, the shared agreements about how to spend time, what to talk about, what brings fulfillment. Society told you that social networking, entertainment consumption, or group activities were inherently meaningful. But awakening reveals these values as arbitrary constructions. Therefore, friendships built on these foundations lose their psychological gravity. You can't force yourself to care about social interactions that feel fundamentally hollow. Jung called this the collision with social meaninglessness. the stage where previously important relationships feel empty because they were based on unexamined assumptions about what human connection is supposed to be about. This is why you might decline invitations, feeling like nothing social matters. Your consciousness has expanded beyond the social meaning system that supported those relationships, but the new social understanding hasn't crystallized yet. Jung compared this to social winter, a necessary dormancy period where the old social growth dies back so new growth can emerge. The friendships belong to the old meaning system. They have to decompose before authentic connections can develop. Comment if all social activities now feel pointless. I'm lost between who I was socially and who I'm becoming. Jung discovered that this social meaninglessness isn't permanent isolation, it's fertile solitude. Something new is gestating in the space where your old relationships used to live. The authentic connection, emergence. Here's where Jung's understanding becomes transformative. He discovered that the death of persona-based friendships creates space for what he called authentic soul connections, relationships that emerge from your true nature rather than your psychological needs. Jung distinguished between persona relationships and self-relationships. Persona relationships serve the mask you wear for the world. Self-relationships serve the deeper truth of who you are. Before awakening, most friendships were persona relationships disguised as authentic connections. But when the persona dissolves during awakening, space opens for genuine soul recognition. What I call consciousness-based connection. Instead of bonding over shared activities, you connect through shared awareness. Instead of relating through mutual problems, you relate through mutual growth. Instead of connecting to avoid loneliness, you connect to celebrate authenticity. Jung called this process individuation in relationship, connecting with others from who you truly are, rather than who you think you should be socially. Your old friendships had to die because they belonged to the socially acceptable version of yourself. What emerges next will belong to the actually authentic version. This is why you can't force your old relationships back to life. You're trying to resurrect connections that belong to a psychological identity that no longer exists. It's like trying to wear social clothes that no longer fit, not because you've grown physically, but because you've grown psychologically. Jung documented that authentic soul connections often look completely different from persona-driven friendships. Maybe you had large social circles, but now you're drawn to one-on-one depth conversations. Maybe you enjoyed party environments, but now you prefer quiet nature walks with conscious individuals. These new connections aren't friendships in the old sense. They're not about entertainment or distraction. They're about mutual recognition and authentic sharing. Jung called them self-realizing relationships, ways your authentic nature connects with other authentic natures. Comment if you're sensing different kinds of connections emerging. Quality over quantity feels essential now. But Jung warned that this emergence can't be rushed. Authentic connections reveal themselves in divine timing. Your job isn't to force new friendships into existence. It's to remain open to soul recognition when it naturally occurs. The consciousness magnetism principle. Jung developed specific insights about how awakened consciousness attracts authentic relationships, what I call the vibrational alignment process. He discovered that consciousness operates like a frequency. When your awareness expands, you begin broadcasting at a different vibrational level. This new frequency naturally repels unconscious individuals while attracting other conscious beings. It's not something you do deliberately. It's something your expanded awareness does automatically. Jung called this conscious magnetism, the way authentic consciousness draws authentic consciousness like a spiritual magnet. But this process requires complete release of your old social patterns. First, Jung emphasized accepting the social dissolution. You need to acknowledge that something real has died. Not just individual friendships, but the socially dependent version of yourself that needed constant external validation to feel connected. This social grief is sacred because it honors the psychological transformation you're undergoing. Don't try to convince yourself you'll reconnect with old friends. Don't force yourself back into social patterns that no longer resonate. Jung understood that authentic transformation requires complete social surrender before anything new can emerge. Second, Jung recommended shadow integration in solitude. Instead of avoiding the loneliness your social connections use to manage, start developing a conscious relationship with your own company. Learn to sit with yourself without distraction. Practice being present with your own thoughts and emotions. Jung discovered that when you stop running from solitude through social distractions, that same solitude transforms into creative solitude. The loneliness becomes self-discovery. The isolation becomes inner richness. The social void becomes spiritual fullness. Third, Jung suggested authentic availability. Make yourself available for genuine connection without forcing or seeking it. Engage in activities that reflect your authentic interests. Attend events that align with your expanded consciousness. Be open to recognition when it occurs naturally. Jung called this conscious presence, allowing your authentic self to be visible in the world without the pressure of social performance or approval seeking. The goal isn't to find new friends. It's to become available for soul recognition when other awakened beings cross your path. Comment if you're learning to enjoy your own company. Solitude has become sanctuary. Jung understood that this social integration phase requires patience and trust. Your authentic connections will manifest when your consciousness is ready to support them. Forcing leads to more persona building. Allowing leads to genuine soul recognition. The conscious relationship distinction. Jung made a crucial distinction about relationship phases that explains why social isolation often intensifies after major awakenings. He argued that the first half of life is devoted to what he called social adaptation, establishing connections, group belonging, and conforming to collective relationship expectations. But the second half of life requires a fundamental reorientation toward authentic connection. Jung called this the afternoon of relationships, and he observed that people who don't make this transition often experience what feels like social crisis. Your friendships dying might be a sign that you're being called into this deeper phase of relational development. During the morning of life, relationships serve ego development. They help you build identity, social status, and group belonging. But during the afternoon of life, relationships must serve soul development. They become vehicles for mutual recognition, authentic sharing, and consciousness expansion. This is why forcing your old friendships back to life feels so futile. You're trying to use afternoon consciousness to engage in morning relationship patterns. Jung discovered that people who successfully navigate this transition often find themselves drawn to completely different forms of connection. Instead of large social groups, they might prefer intimate one-on-one conversations. Instead of activity-based friendships, they might focus on consciousness-based connections. The key insight Jung offered is that you're not losing your capacity for human connection. You're outgrowing the forms of connection that belong to an earlier phase of psychological development. What wants to emerge is maturity, appropriate, consciousness-appropriate relating. This is why the friendship dissolution phenomenon, while disorienting, is actually evidence of healthy psychological development. Your psyche is calling you deeper, asking you to relate from a more authentic, integrated, conscious place. The soul recognition process. Jung's most profound insight was that the death of old friendships isn't social failure. It's what he called relational rebirth. The person who emerges from this process isn't a socially broken version of who you were. They were a more authentic version of who you've always been, underneath the social conditioning. Your old friendships served their purpose during your unconscious phase. They gave you belonging, identity, distraction, and validation when you didn't know how to access these things through self-connection. But awakening means you no longer need external relationships to feel whole. Jung called this integrated relating, the ability to connect not from psychological neediness, but from psychological fullness. When relationships return to your life, they serve authentic expression rather than emotional compensation. Maybe group socializing returns, but now it's conscious community rather than unconscious networking. Maybe intimate friendships resurge, but now they're soul recognition rather than ego validation. Maybe social activities come back, but now they're authentic sharing rather than performance anxiety. Jung discovered that individuals who complete this social transition become far more capable of genuine love than they ever were before, but their connections serve consciousness rather than conditioning, authenticity rather than approval, recognition rather than need. This is why Jung considered the friendship dissolution phenomenon a gift rather than a loss. It forces you to discover the difference between connecting to avoid loneliness and connecting to celebrate consciousness. That difference changes everything. Comment if you're starting to sense authentic connections emerging. I'm attracting soul family rather than social family. Jung spent decades documenting this pattern because he recognized it as one of the most reliable signs of genuine psychological maturation. When someone stops needing external relationships to feel worthy, they become capable of authentic love. So there you have it. Jung's complete framework for understanding why your friendships died after awakening and what that death actually means. Remember what I said at the beginning. Jung discovered that spiritual awakening doesn't expand your social circle. It destroys it. But now you understand why those friendships belong to the ego-driven, shadow-avoiding, persona-building version of yourself that awakening necessarily dissolves. You're not antisocial because you can't relate to unconscious people anymore. You're not broken because small talk feels impossible. You're not defective because you prefer solitude to fake connection. You're psychologically evolving. Jung understood that this social death is actually relational birth, the emergence of an authentic self that doesn't need external validation to feel connected to life. What feels like social death is actually social preparation. Your soul had to kill your ego-driven relationships before it could birth soul-driven connections. The isolation you're feeling isn't permanent exile. It's sacred solitude. Something new is growing in the space where your old friendships used to live. Jung spent his life studying this transformation because he recognized it as one of the most important social developments a human being can undergo. You're not losing your capacity for connection. You're graduating to authentic connection. The question isn't how to get your old friends back. The question is, who wants to recognize the authentic you that no longer needs social validation to feel whole? Comment below. I trust the dissolution before the recognition. If you're ready to embrace this transformation process, Jung would tell you to be patient with the loneliness. Honor the social death. Trust the process. Authentic connections are trying to find you, but only after you've fully released what no longer serves your awakened consciousness. If you want to explore more of Jung's insights about rare consciousness patterns, check out my video 8 Signs You Have a Mind. 99% of people can't. Understand, where we explore how awakened minds process social reality in ways most people can't comprehend. And if this video helped you understand why your friendships feel dead, share it with someone else who might be struggling with the same confusion. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is help another person realize they're not socially broken. They're socially breaking through. Your authentic connections are worth the death of every fake friendship you ever maintained. Jung understood this, and now, hopefully, so do you. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.